firstly, just wanted to say a huge thank you to all of you, to absolutely everybody for joining the event this afternoon. Over the next 90 or so minutes, we're going to hear from 4 absolutely fabulous speakers, each with a different perspective on the subject of educators and maths anxiety, covering really the importance of number confidence amongst teachers, educators, teaching assistants, etc., and how together we can inspire maths positive futures. And I think, just looking at the numbers of participants today, clearly many of you have joined in, and that's a testament to the interest in this subject and the importance of the topic as well. So just first off, before we get into things, just to note that this session is being recorded and it will be shared after the event on the National Numeracy, Maths Anxiety Trust and Learnus websites. And before we get started as well, this may have already been taken care of, but if not, please can I ask that everybody who is not on the panel speaking to please turn off your cameras and mute your microphones, please. And then next up, just to firstly introduce myself, I'm Sam Sims. I'm the Chief Executive of National Numeracy. And National Numeracy is a charity that aims to empower adults and children in the UK to get on with numbers so that they can fulfill their potential, whether that's at work, home, at school, every aspect of their lives. And our work improves how people understand and work with numbers in everyday life, hopefully towards sparking better opportunities and therefore brighter futures. And I am more than delighted that we have collaborated with the amazing Maths Anxiety Trust to put on this event today. Now, the Maths Anxiety Trust was started by Shirley Conran. Hello, Shirley, and welcome back in 2018. And Shirley Conran is a true pioneer in bringing a spotlight on the issue of maths anxiety, which up until that point really wasn't discussed and talked about that widely at all. Today, the Maths Anxiety Trust is an independent, not-for-profit organisation, and it aims to raise awareness of maths anxiety and to enable people with maths anxiety to achieve their potential in education and the workplace. So as you can hear by those 2 descriptions, there's a real alignment in the missions of National Numeracy and the Maths Anxiety Trust, which is why we're holding this event. We know that from our work with schools and teacher training organisations that many teachers, teaching assistants, support workers, as well as children struggle with low confidence when it comes to maths for perfectly understandable reasons. And in this session, we'll look at the issue of maths anxiety amongst educators, how it can affect both adults and the children that they support. We'll also explore the importance of confidence with numbers amongst educators and look at how I think we'll come on to how educators can be supported to improve their own confidence with maths as well. So I will get on with it and I'll introduce the panel to start with. Firstly, I'm absolutely delighted that we are joined by Professor Margaret Brown, OBE, who is the Emeritus Professor of Mathematics Education at King's College London and President of the Maths Anxiety Trust. We are also very lucky to be joined by Dr. Tom Hunt, who is the Associate Professor in Psychology at the University of Derby and leads the university's Mathematics Anxiety Research Group. It is also a real privilege to be joined by Gillian Lynch, who is acting deputy head teacher at St Aidan's Primary School in Wishaw, which actually took part in National Numeracy's Parental Engagement Programme just a few years ago. And last but by no means least, we have Sue Skyrme, who is a schools and parental engagement expert for National Numeracy, a former head teacher and teacher trainer. So I think we have an absolutely incredible panel for you this afternoon. So the final piece of, I think, housekeeping before we get started and into the discussion is that there will be some time for questions. We'll pause after each section, depending on the time that we have. So please write any questions that you have for the panel, most importantly in the chat box, and we'll do it via the chat. And if we can, hopefully we can get through as many questions as possible. If we don't firstly, I apologise, and secondly, I want to assure you that all questions will be saved and then answered offline following the event. So I think that concludes all of the housekeeping and introductions, and we'll get started and go straight into the questions for our panel. And I'd like to start really by establishing some context around the issue. You know, what is maths anxiety and how does it impact people who experience it? And to start with, please, can we start with Tom, please?
Thanks, Sam. Yeah, very happy to start with this because it is such an important thing to get right, I think, to understand what is maths anxiety. I mean, on the face of it, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? But actually, if we break it down, there is a lot more to it. Maths anxiety can affect people to varying degrees. It can affect people the world over, irrespective of level of education or the stage of their life. And I would say it can have certainly an emotional component to it. So it can create a lot of panic, create a sense of stress, a sense of helplessness. And it's certainly got a cognitive component as well. So what we do know from empirical research is that it's related to worry. It's related to rumination, intrusive thoughts, the kind of negative thoughts that can really impact your ability to engage with maths learning and just general numbers and maths in general. So, you know, people who are feeling maths anxious will often have troublesome thoughts, particularly those that impact their self-concept and their self-confidence. And it often creates that sense of, you know, your mind going blank, that sense of mental disorganization, which particularly impacts work within the classroom and those more, you know, tricky problems as well. But it's certainly not something that is a binary thing. You know, it can affect people, as I say, on different levels, and also it can be situation specific as well. So while some people may have extreme maths anxiety in the face of numbers, actually for a lot of people, it comes down to the situation that they're in, and often whether that situation is kind of perceived as being high pressure or not, and what that means in terms of pressure is going to differ from one person to another.
Thank you very much, Tom. Gillian, could you provide a perspective on this, please?
Yeah, sure. So I'm speaking from the view of someone who really suffered from maths anxiety from when I was a young child right through to the beginning of my teaching career. And like Tom said, the mind going blank, for me, that was really what happened. You know, when I got in situations during lessons, I just felt like no matter how much support I would get within the classroom, I just couldn't do it. And it's a real feeling of disbelief and, you know, this true thought that I'll never ever get over this, and no matter how much help I can get and how many people try and support me, I'll just never be able to do it, and it just becomes a fixed mindset. So yeah, it's a really horrible feeling. It's lots of worrying, lots of self-doubt, and it can be quite debilitating and really difficult to get over.
Thanks so much, Gillian. Sue, can we come on to you next, please?
Yes, like Tom, it's interesting to start with the definition, isn't it? So I think it is an uncontrollable feeling of tension and anxiety, as Gillian was just describing, which affects cognition, and it really disables people from being able to manipulate numbers or solve problems. So therefore it can impact on their everyday life, their functional life, just going to the shops, just doing a recipe, just, I don't know, buying petrol, or in an academic situation. And the impact, I think, like any phobia, maths anxiety stops our working memory. So it can manifest itself physiologically, cognitively, and emotionally, but it can also be irrational. The only thing I can link it to really is my fear of spiders. I'm quite a calm, cool, professional woman, but if a big black spider runs across the room, I would absolutely freeze, and my ability to rationalise just goes out the window. I think evolution has hardwired us to be sort of scared of cliff edges and snakes and things that could have caused us harm. And then perhaps in another country, a spider could, but I'm talking here on the Isle of Wight. But maths anxiety is very much a learned response, and it comes from our own experiences, either as learners or through poor teaching. And I think it can result almost in a fear of the fear. Trainees, teachers have reported to me not listening throughout my session because they're waiting for me to ask them something. And if you translate that into a classroom situation, it's that anticipation really of being publicly shamed, is their perception. The impact is often therefore to develop avoidance tactics. You know, I won't do that because it involves maths, even down to avoiding jobs that they might apply for, or in my experience, the people that want to train as a teacher won't apply because they perceive if they can't do maths, they wouldn't be any good at teaching. Parents obviously avoid helping their children with homework if they're suffering from anxiety. And for pupils, it's a whole list of things. It can be not starting work, spending too much time on easy questions, automatically saying, I don't know, saying the first number they can think of. And then they oft-seen tactics of, you know, sharpening pencils for 10 minutes or going to the toilet and sitting there for 10 minutes because they really just don't want to engage in the maths. But perhaps they just can't even articulate that anxiety. So it really becomes a fight or flight response and can be really disabilitating.
Thank you so much, Sue. And we will in a moment start getting into some of the impacts more specifically in a moment. And before we move on, I'm very keen to hear from Margaret in just a moment. Before we do, just a reminder that you know, if any questions pop up, reflections, please do use the chat function as we go along and add those in, because we'll, as I say, after each section we'll try and take some questions if they are there. So please do think about if you do have anything you would like to address to the panel, put it in the chat box and we'll pick it up from there. So just to come on please to Margaret again, what is maths anxiety and how it impacts people who experiences it, please.
I'm just going to add a little bit about prevalence. I mean, it's really hard to define because it comes in different degrees. So obviously we have people who are the equivalent of Nobel Prize winners who still admit that they're anxious when they're put into public performance in maths, to people who really live with it all the time. But it seems as though it seriously impacts about 6 to 10% of the population who are panicking most of the time that maths is around them. There's another sort of 15 or so % who are seriously worried about maths. And then there's different degrees going up from that. I mean, about 50% of people say that they're anxious some of the time. And as I say, nearly all of us are anxious from, you know, on odd occasions. The particular occasions, of course, are those where you have a public performance or where you're under time pressure. And there are very few people who can maintain a kind of calm attitude under those circumstances. How it connects with other things, it has some connection with age. It tends to go up towards age 16 and then down again. It tends to be more prevalent in women than in men because girls on the whole are less confident about maths than boys, and that carries on through life. And it does tend to be more pronounced in those with lower attainment than higher attainment, but you know, for reasons that are sort of chicken and egg. But there are people who have relatively high attainment who are actually very maths anxious as well.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And I think one of the questions that we have coming through, I think we've covered this a little bit, but it'd be good to get a bit more context here. So one of the questions is, can you talk a little bit more about what causes maths anxiety in the first place? How does it develop and why and when? For this one, maybe if we start, just to come on to Tom, maybe, I don't know if you can provide a perspective on this one.
Sure, yeah. There's some quite big questions there where I don't think there is a definitive answer. I mean, certainly, as Margaret mentioned, there is a kind of chicken or egg question to this. And I think, you know, the research is kind of getting a little bit closer to the answer. I think, you know, without sort of being on the fence too much, it is a bit of both in terms of kind of poor performance leading to the development of anxiety, but also, of course, feelings of anxiety that might impact performance. So it's a bit of a vicious kind of cycle there. But yeah, certainly there's evidence that quite poor, low achievement early on can lead to the development of maths anxiety, and that the direction of that relationship appears to be in that way. So clearly tackling some of the issues with numeracy skills quite early on is really going to be important for reducing any development of maths anxiety. But as I say, it can be both ways. It's a vicious cycle. There's lots of evidence, I think, to suggest that other things kind of feed into the anxiety as well, and lots of, as I say, bi-directional relationships. So maths anxiety feeds into self-efficacy, negative attitudes, career aspirations, all these kinds of things, which again kind of have this vicious cycle effect. So negative attitudes can impact your avoidance of anything maths related. That might be study-wise, it might be anything work-related, and any kind of discussion of careers, for example. So if you kind of go on that trajectory where you are avoiding maths, it's going to have that kind of long-term effect, where the more you avoid maths, potentially the more anxious you're going to get, because those skills aren't being kind of topped up and maintained. So hopefully that kind of answers some of the questions at least.
Thank you very much, Tom. Absolutely. Another question we have here is for Margaret. Just the question is where the data is where the data is from, the data that you mentioned there in your response. Is there maybe a couple of places to mention to people to find that kind of data?
Yes, I mean the summary I was using was a paper by Anne Dowker, who's written some very important summaries of the research on maths anxiety, and she summarizes a lot of other research. So I mean, this comes from a number of different sources, and of course they all use slightly different definitions, slightly different methods of collecting the data. So there isn't a definitive answer to who and how many and when and so on.
Thank you, Margaret.
I can add the reference to the paper afterwards if we have a sort of I can't do it this moment, but later.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Margaret.
Sorry, can I just add, it's also on the Maths Anxiety website.
So head over to the Maths Anxiety website. You'll find more context and details there as well. The Maths Anxiety Trust website. And the next question is for you, Gillian. What was the breakthrough moment for you that alleviated your maths anxiety?
It was more of a sort of slow process. I was given the role of maths lead in the school, so I'd always masked my maths anxiety and hid it. I was given the role of maths lead, and I went home and cried my eyes out because I thought, I can't do this. I can't lead maths within a school and stand up and pretend that I'm good with numbers when I'm not. So I had to then force myself to take part in all the opportunities that I'd missed throughout my career, such as training opportunities and different development courses and things. And it turns out I just really had some gaps in my early number knowledge. I'd always taught upper primary. And when I had sort of self-taught myself again, some basic things, I realised, I was worrying over nothing. I don't know why I panicked so much about numbers. I just had to learn it a different way. And perhaps the way I was taught when we were at school didn't really suit my style of learning. So the way that we teach now was better. And once I overcame that barrier, something just clicked. And then that's when my love of sort of numbers really kind of strengthened. And so, yeah, it was more for me about stopping avoiding opportunities, sort of finding out the gaps that I had myself and then moving forward from that.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Gillian. So you went from that, it sounds like you went from that position of avoidance to, to ultimately now loving
avoidance.
Okay, thank you. I am keen just to move on and get a little bit into something we've already touched on a little bit, but to go into it into more detail. So I'd like to ask the panel in particular how maths anxiety can affect teachers. And on this one, again, let's come straight back to you, Gillian, just a bit more on how it can affect teachers.
Yeah, so just like I've said already, you know, I think for me at the beginning, there was a lot of missed opportunities and constant masking how I was really feeling. I think, you know, there's a perception of teachers that we're supposed to know everything and we're supposed to have the answer at the drop of a hat, and that's obviously not true. I had a really bright class, that my first ever class were a really able class, and before every maths lesson, I would have to do all the exercises myself the night before. So my lessons became really scripted, and you know, good teaching should be reflective and should be responsive. So, you know, it affects us in that way, and I think it's just it can, again, like I said, lots of missed opportunities, lots of self-doubt. It's not a nice feeling going into your workplace every day, worrying and panicking that you're going to do or say the wrong thing. So it's just, it can just, you know, it can really affect you, and it can be quite crippling.
Thanks, Gillian. And Sue, what's your perspective on this one?
Okay, well, I'd also like to reflect on how it affects potential teachers, because I'm thinking about a young lady who was desperate to become a teacher and in every respect had the potential to be an excellent teacher. But she suffered from maths anxiety. And when we had this online skills test, which thank God have now been abolished, they were all timed. And it wasn't like normal exam technique where you could go back to a question that you hadn't answered. These just rattled on question after question. And no matter how many times we practiced it at home, she could not do it online. And we lost a potentially excellent teacher. So I think it starts right back then. But once they're in the classroom, I think it does turn enthusiastic teachers in other curriculum areas into pedestrian teachers in maths. And their whole body language, we all know when we're watching somebody how the body language and the passion comes through. And it doesn't if they've got negative feelings, and they transfer those feelings to the pupils. I think if they're anxious, teachers very much stay within their comfort zone. Gillian alluded to scripts, and I think teachers often lean on published material to deliver a lesson. And that's not written for their children in their class. It's only written as an exemplar. But they lack the confidence or the expertise to adapt that then to meet pupil needs. So some teachers, I find, restrict themselves to Key Stage 1 because they fear the harder maths further up the school. Interestingly, you were the other way around, Gillian. But even if they're excellent teachers in other curriculum areas, they fear teaching that maths higher up, so they restrict themselves. They tend to avoid CPD to develop their expertise because they don't want to be publicly shamed, and they feel they're going to show themselves up somehow. They often lack flexibility or different approaches when a child is struggling, because they're unable to unpick those misconceptions into bite-sized pieces. So they tend to use, and I'm generalising hugely here, obviously, but I can only say from what I've observed, but they tend to use the Englishman abroad syndrome and just say the same thing over and over in a louder voice, because they can't unpick it and do it a different way, because their own confidence won't allow them to do that. If they suffer themselves, they also tend to believe that maths is an innate skill, which is really worrying, because that impacts on pupils' attitudes towards maths. And they will develop strategies to hide all of this because they'll be reluctant to know that pupils don't enjoy their lessons. I think the other point I wanted to make, they sometimes can't make those cross-curricular links that actually maximise learning opportunities, because they can't see the maths in all its forms in every other subject. And that's particularly obviously at secondary school, but it's also relevant in primary school. So it does have a huge impact on their entire sort of working life in school with pupils.
Thank you, Sue. Really rich, ideas there and reflections on the impact that it can have on teachers. And I think where you started there, that's one that strikes me, that the impact it can have on actually getting in the way or preventing potentially fantastic teachers and practitioners from actually getting into teaching or into practice themselves, and that's a something that we really really should try and support and address. Thank you. So next, I'd really like to come on to Margaret, please. What's your perspective on how maths anxiety can affect teachers?
Yeah, I think you know, the people I've been involved with in research have tended to go two ways. One is a bit like just what Sue's rather described as avoidance techniques. I mean, avoiding number work in some cases. I mean, I followed one teacher in a classroom who I discovered really did an awful lot of space and shape and statistics, but actually hardly ever did number operations. And then there can be an avoidance of discussion or questions, or, you know, just anything that challenges their own knowledge. And quite often teachers develop anxiety because they see maths as a very out there subject, as very abstract and something that's nothing to do with them and is just a set of facts and techniques. And they will often do that in the class as well, that it's seen as these are the things you have to know, these are the things you have to be able to do. I'll do one on the whiteboard or on the smart board, and then you have to do lots of these. So it's failing to make all the connections that they haven't made for themselves, that they avoid and find it really difficult to help children to make as well. However, sometimes I think teachers are so conscious of how awful it is to be anxious about maths that they make a big effort to try and make sure their children don't suffer. And I think I'm thinking about people like Gillian, who actually will make a real effort to make maths much more friendly, much more appealing, much more sensitive to children's ideas, much more flexible. So I think it can, you know, in general, it closes down what's happening in the classroom to be very narrow and boring, but it can actually have the effect of teachers wanting to make an effort as well.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I'll come to I'd like to come on to you, Tom, in just a moment. Really fascinating reflections here. I just wanted to pull out a comment on the chat from Natalie, who said that she's currently on a PGCE in a school placement at the moment, had bad experience with maths and from when they're in school, and dread whenever they hear the word maths. And you know, knowing that they need to overcome this fear, and that saying that their current mentor is being really helpful and supportive, and starting to build that confidence going forward. Thank you so much for sharing that comment. It's really important. And you know, as you're hearing from the panel, you're absolutely not alone. And you know, we will in the second half of this discussion get on a little bit onto some of the support that's there and that's needed, and hopefully that will provide some help as well. So Tom, just to come back to that question, what's your perspective on how maths anxiety can affect teachers?
I think what we have to remember is, you know, teachers are human at the end of the day, and I think, you know, maths anxiety can impact them in the same way as it can, you know, impact anybody else. And you know, just to reiterate the point about confidence, really, that's, you know, a proven link. You know, maths anxiety in teachers is certainly related to lower confidence, and clearly avoidance as well. So just picking up on the point that Gillian said really around just avoiding those opportunities that might arise. And you know, this can have a bit of a build-up effect over time, where, you know, if you miss opportunities like that to do further training, or just to, like I say, maintain certain skill levels in maths, that can have a bit of a domino effect, and that's certainly something to bear in mind. But I think, you know, it can impact them in the same way as others, such as increased stress levels. Physiologically, they can get those kind of anxious symptoms, particularly in a situation that may feel high pressured. So you know, I'm thinking, you know, year 6 with SATs and those kind of examination settings, and maybe some of the pressures that teachers might face around formal assessments. This can often be quite anxiety provoking as well. And this really, I think, relates to this differentiation between maths anxiety on the one hand and maths teaching anxiety on the other, because there is a subtle difference between the two. You know, many teachers might experience maths anxiety, but actually the anxiety is quite specific to the teaching of maths as well. So there might be a kind of a maths anxiety more generally there in the background, but for some teachers it might not be so bad, but as I say, it kind of arises more in that kind of teaching context, particularly around their own confidence. So anxiety is about, am I going to know the answer to a question, you know, something that comes up in class that I'm not familiar with. So, you know, how am I going to deal with that kind of on the spot question? But also anxiety around how children in their class are going to perform as well, and maybe some kind of anxiety around, you know, is that performance a reflection of their teaching? You know, those kinds of thoughts. And, you know, this can all kind of feed into anxious feelings about the teaching of maths, as well as any kind of general feelings about maths.
Thank you, Tom. Just to come on, we've had a question in the chat for Gillian. This person would like to know, they'd like to do their teaching qualification, but with dyslexia, they're worried and stressed about it. They want to do their GCSE maths, but can you offer any advice, Gillian? They're currently a teaching assistant.
I think if you're able to get any extra support, then take it. When I was applying to do my undergraduate for teaching, I knew that my level of maths, well, I felt like the level of maths that I had wasn't high enough to get in. So I did seek extra support, and I had a tutor. And actually, it was just someone who explained it differently, and you know, it helped me to that point. So, but don't hold back. You know, there are, especially now since lockdown, so many things have become available on the internet, webinars, tutorials, you know, even just going onto YouTube and looking at things that are, you know, that are useful teaching videos now since the school's closed. Do as much of that as you can. Try and upskill yourself if you feel that you don't have the skill level, and just really just have the knowledge to know that you can do it, and just don't let this be the barrier that holds you back, because you can overcome it.
Thank you, Gillian. I really love that. Don't let this be the barrier that holds you back. You can overcome it. It's absolutely true. Would anybody else like just to contribute on that one? There may be others that feel the same in terms of being worried and stressed about pursuing a teaching qualification. Anyone else on the panel like to come in on that one? Otherwise, we'll carry on. There's a few more questions coming in.
I'd just like to say it's good to hear from somebody who's a teaching assistant, because I think we do need to bring teaching assistants very much into the discussion as well as teachers, because many of them have a great effect on students, particularly lower attaining students. And, you know, they're a very important part of the teaching workforce.
And could I just add then that it's really important that they realise it's not their fault. That if they're feeling anxious about maths, I always view it as a building wall. And if the bricks are not there at the bottom, then you have to go back and fill them in. I've done some GCSE tuition where we've gone right back to year 1 and year 2 work to fill in those gaps. And as Gillian said, if you get a good tutor that can do that for you, because you don't realise what you don't know, you don't know what you don't know until you start to look into it and unpick it. And you need to go right back and realise what you weren't perhaps taught properly when you were at school. And I think teaching's moved on leaps and bounds since most of us, certainly since I was in school, it's a long time ago. And to realise that there's no shame in going back and revising the very basics in order to build up your understanding.
Great, thank you, Sue. Let's go on. We've got another question here. Do we know if there are any differences between primary and secondary teachers in terms of maths anxiety, or how it affects their teaching? I wonder, maybe is anyone particularly keen to take this question? Otherwise, I
can only say I don't think we know. I don't think we have the data. We do. I think. I mean, talking about the specialist maths teaching force, it's likely there's less maths anxiety there, obviously. But I have been interested in the past in training maths graduates to teach maths, that their fear at the beginning of the course is always not that the children will riot, which is my greatest fear, but that actually they'll be faced with a question they can't answer. And that's always surprised me year after year, that they're more worried about not being able to answer a maths question than they are about lack of control in the classroom.
And I can just add to that a little bit as well. I mean, picking up on Margaret's point, there's very little research actually that does focus on maths anxiety in teachers specifically. There is a couple of studies that have come out very recently to indicate that maths anxiety in teachers is slightly greater in primary level than secondary level. And also some research to indicate a relationship with kind of length of experience as well. So the less experience you have, the greater the maths anxiety level as well. And what we don't know, obviously, without the longitudinal data is too much in the way of cause and effect. So we don't know whether it's that inexperience itself that is kind of causing maths anxiety, or whether there is just a simple difference in terms of sort of a generational thing, or the way in which maths is taught. There could be a number of factors that impact why that sort of experience is related to maths anxiety in the way that it is.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Margaret. Interesting. You've talked about individuals. You've talked also about some of the systems as well. Thinking about teacher training systems within schools, for example. There's a question here about culture, really getting at culture. So the question is that says that there is a culture of toxicity regarding maths, where maths anxiety is taken as a joke. What is being done, or what can be done, to target this culture of toxicity? Would anyone like to pick up on that one?
Well, there has been a certain amount of government backing in the past, not perhaps so much at the moment, going into making maths more attractive to students and teachers. I mean, there are certainly a few examples. I mean, I can say that I've just been involved in opening a place called Maths City in Leeds, which is a place where you can go and play with maths that's specifically aimed at schools and teachers and families. You know, we've had enormous attendance at that, and the whole aim of that is to change people's attitudes to maths. But we have had a number of national reports, including some by Sir Aidan Smith, which have highlighted this as a key national target. But I'm not sure that actually government action has followed up very well as a result of it.
Thank you, Margaret.
I think, if I may come in there, I think going back again to teacher training, and it's something I was going to say under question 4, but as always, it's more relevant to say it now. That perhaps maths anxiety is not recognised with the gravity that it should be. When you apply for a job or teacher training, you have to, or you're meant to, they don't all, confess to suffering from something like dyslexia, so that appropriate support can be put in place for you. But there is no space or no area where they could say, well, actually, I'm anxious about maths. And perhaps it should be raised, the awareness that it is, in a way, a disability. Should be there now, that people can talk about it more.
Thank you, Sue. So kind of a greater awareness, greater ability, therefore, to talk about it, yeah, might help to reduce that toxicity, that cultural toxicity. Yeah. That's. I
know that it's recognised. Yeah. It's not something that's just personal to you, which some people feel. Yeah.
I can just add a little bit to that as well. I've done various sort of workshops and meetings with various teachers at different levels over the last few years, and I would say on the whole, teachers are they very much acknowledge that maths anxiety is there. That people do tend to identify it within their pupils. They want to do something about it, but of course you do get those teachers occasionally who are a little bit skeptical, or might be quite open about maths anxiety, as you kind of alluded to, almost being a joke. And I think that the problem there is often a lack of understanding, or maybe certain misconceptions about what maths anxiety is. And I think events like this really that sometimes just raise that understanding can be really important. And I would also just add that there's a huge evidence base now in terms of empirical research to indicate that maths anxiety is a real thing. You know, this can be separable from other forms of anxiety, for example. This is something that's unique. Of course, it's related to other things as well, general anxiety, test anxiety, but it's certainly something that exists as a unique construct, and plenty of people experience it. So there is the evidence there, and I think it's just really drawing people's attention to that.
Thank you, Tom. And I'm going to stay with you, Tom. A question that we have from Shirley Conran, who says, the question to you, Tom, is that you once told Shirley that your team can cure maths anxiety in classes at the cost of only pennies per person. Can you tell us, Tom, how you developed this technique and when you and from when you started?
Yep. I think the first thing to say is, you know, that there are several strategies that have been tested over the last few decades, really. But you know, these strategies tend to be tested in quite small numbers, not across, you know, lots of different populations. But there's lots of evidence to suggest that you know, there are strategies available to support people with maths anxiety. The work that we've been doing at Derby has tended to take quite a holistic approach in terms of drawing together multiple strategies, if you like, to sort of capitalize on all the things that appear to work well, and to also kind of take into account individual learners, because this is one of the things that I'm quite keen on myself advocating, is this sort of impact at an individual level. So of course maths anxiety can impact lots of people, but it does impact those students differently and teachers differently. So when we look at strategies, we need to identify what those individual differences are in order to support them. There's no kind of one size fits all approach. So the approach that we've been taking recently is really this kind of holistic approach. It can be done through workshops, which I would say take kind of two approaches. The first part relates to what I mentioned before, which is just raising understanding and awareness. So, you know, actually just presenting having that kind of time and space really dedicated to talking about the issue is often quite cathartic. It's quite therapeutic for teachers, for pupils. It's affording them an opportunity to talk about something that maybe isn't really spoken about that often. So that sort of raising awareness and understanding of what maths anxiety is kind of the first part of it. And the second part, as I say, is really just delivering some potential strategies that people can take away and practice. And that might be in the classroom, it might also be at home as well. So with homework, for example. And often these strategies are transferable. You know, it's not just about maths, it's about how to deal with anxiety. Yes, in maths anxious situations, but these are life skills as well that people can take further. So yeah, the work we've tended to do, as I say, it takes this more kind of holistic approach, sometimes through workshops, sometimes through kind of a workbook approach, where a teacher works with a class maybe over a period of a few weeks, kind of gradually working through a workbook.
Great, thanks so much for providing that detail, Tom. We're going to, I think, move on to the next question, and really moving on to the interconnectivity between teachers, maths, or teachers, teaching assistants, support workers, educators more broadly, their maths anxiety and attitudes towards maths, and how they might affect children. So what is that relationship, and how does it potentially or in practice play out? Can we start please with you, Sue?
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, there's a lot of overlap between these questions, isn't there? But as I said earlier, teachers can inadvertently transfer their own anxiety, or at the very least lack of enthusiasm, to children. I think children are incredibly perceptive, and they may not enjoy the lesson as a result, and then they transfer that feeling to not enjoying the subject. So they tend to be given simple closed tasks, because investigative tasks which open up new areas of mathematical exploration could be well out of the teacher's comfort zone, due to the unpredictability and the tangents that they can go off at. They tend to try and keep it within what they have planned. So that takes me back to the point about planning, not necessarily meeting pupils' needs or meeting challenges sufficiently. And without meaning to, and I many of the teachers that I've spoken to or worked with are very conscious of their own maths anxiety, and they don't want to transfer it to their children, but sometimes they don't tend to talk positively about maths. For example, and you've all heard this before, but I've actually heard it, you know, if you misbehave, you'll miss your PE and do maths. Well, exactly what message is that passing down to the children? You know, that maths is not as enjoyable as PE. So it's very, very simple things that they don't realise they're saying. They tend not to make those links and point out the maths in everyday lives, which obviously ensures purposeful learning. And they often praise children, I find, for their cleverness rather than their effort, which is something that we recommend, praising effort rather than ability. Because if a child answers a question quickly or solves a complicated problem, they almost admire that because they recognise that they're anxious about that. So, oh, you're really clever, you did that quickly. And again, it's passing on subliminal messages that they don't realise they're doing. I think anxious teachers tend not to foster a growth mindset because they're not in that place themselves. So we all know it's vital to promote the value of maths. Pupils need to know the benefits that maths will bring them, the belief that everyone can enjoy numeracy and everybody can improve their numeracy. And you know, you've got to believe that. And persistence, recognise that everyone struggles in order to succeed, and that's part of the learning process. But I think these are all measures of a good practitioner when they do that, and maths anxiety will adversely impact on a teacher's ability to develop these skills with children because they don't feel it themselves. We all know that a teacher's passion, enthusiasm and ability to inspire in the classroom is actually reflected in their deeply held beliefs. And of course, if they don't value maths and they don't believe in maths and they don't persist, that's going to come over, and it has a hugely negative impact on their ability to teach as well as they might do in other curriculum areas. It's not reflecting on them as a teacher as a whole, it's just particularly in maths. So it is really important to be conscious of passing on those positive attitudes, and of course, because it's my baby, sharing them with parents who often say things like, I can't do maths, so he won't be able to do maths either, and eliminating that sort of belief in some sort of mathematical gene. So it's a whole package of really thinking about how you present the maths in your classroom, however you're feeling yourself.
Thank you, Sue. That's fascinating, and so many different areas there. Just a quick reminder again, just to everybody, you know, please do, if any of this, these reflections, these points are prompting questions, please do put them in the chat. It would be great to capture those questions. We'll try, as I say, to cover as many as we can going along, but we want, you know, it's really important that we can have that interaction, and really, so if there's anything that is just prompting for you, please do put it in and we'll try and get to it, or we'll answer those after the event itself. Thank you again, Sue. Tom, can I come on to you, please?
Yeah, I would completely agree there with Sue. I mean, there's plenty of evidence to indicate that maths anxiety in teachers is certainly related to their approach to teaching. They will take a more kind of traditional, less progressive approach. There's a rigidity there in terms of how they teach. There's less flexibility, and potentially, I think, a lack of acknowledgement maybe of certain individual differences and where certain children might be struggling, and that partly might be down to their own confidence and their sort of focus, their attention on their teaching, because maybe they feel as though they have to put more effort into it almost to try and deliver a certain thing in class. So I think, you know, that focus, that attention on what they're delivering sometimes can deviate from their attention towards other things, and identify maybe where there are children who struggle. So I think that's something that needs to be you know, kind of recognized. But yeah, I think, you know, often it's inadvertent. You know, these things manifest in terms of very subtle language and behavior, and you know, it can happen over a prolonged period of time where that anxiety, negative attitudes, as Sue said, that lack of enthusiasm can sometimes only really transfer over a period of time. It might be a term or it might be a school year, but it does, the evidence suggests that there is that transference of maths anxiety, and it's clearly not always down, it's not because the teacher wants that to happen. Something very complex but very subtle could be happening over a period of time, but there is some positive aspects to it as well, in terms of teachers who kind of have come through the other side, where they've identified as being maths anxious in the past, and they're often very motivated to support children who are maths anxious, and to try and avoid them being maths anxious in the first place. So you could say that they have increased empathy, increased compassion maybe, as a result of their own past experiences.
Thank you, Tom. Margaret, could I come on to you next, please, on that one?
Yeah, I was just looking at the research. I haven't been able to find really any research which directly relates the effects on children in terms of any kind of quantitative measures, but we do have research which suggests that teachers who are who teach in a transmission kind of style, as maths as a set of facts and skills, which is how I have to say that our Ofsted latest report on research would like everybody to teach maths, which is absolutely horrifying. But teachers who do it that way get worse results in primary than teachers who have a connectionist approach, which means that they connect together not just different bits of maths, but also connecting with applications, connecting with children's real life situations and so on. So we do have some data that suggests that teachers with anxiety will get worse results, but it's very indirect. The other thing we have is that on participation rates, we have some data that suggests that schools where a large proportion of students after GCSE carry on with maths, those schools, if you control for other factors, there are schools where students feel they've had really good, exciting, fun maths lessons, as opposed to those where they feel that the lessons have been boring. Then in that case, you tend to get a lower participation rate post 16. So it's really important that we do try and help teachers, support teachers in achieving much more sort of linked up and connected and exciting lessons.
Thank you, Margaret. That's really helpful, and I'm keen also to come on to Gillian. What's your perspective on this from your own experience and that of your school, and as a practitioner? What's your experience here?
Yeah, I mean, the things that Sue said earlier about, making those mistakes, I cringed when I think about some of the language I used to use in the classroom, like, oh, I wasn't very good at maths either when I was younger, but let's just do it and let's just try and get on with it. And, that when I think about that, that was awful, but you can't truly be positive about numbers if you're anxious about them. So, and we know that, you learn better when you're in a positive and creative environment. But like also Margaret said earlier, if you overcome the maths anxiety as a teacher, then I truly do believe that you can be a better maths teacher, because, Sue talked about being able to unpick the challenges. And for me now, when I'm teaching number, I can unpick it, and I can empathise with the learners, because when I recognise children that have got maths, when I recognise learners and recognise signs of maths anxiety within them, I say, I used to feel like you. Here's the things I used to struggle with, but here's how I overcome, or how I could overcome this problem. Why don't you try this? Or why don't we try another way? And I think, teachers who overcome maths anxiety, we can support the children by also helping support the parents, because I have a lot of conversations at parents' night, of parents who have really anxious children, and actually they've got maths anxiety themselves. And I can help them by saying, let's look at the vocabulary you're using, or how are you discussing maths in the house? Are you positive when you're doing homework? So it obviously does affect children in a negative way, but we can turn it around, and it can help us affect them in a more positive way if we just, if we overcome it and we use that as a strength rather than a barrier.
Great, thank you so much, Gillian. I think there was a comment on the chat, I think, earlier about that point that you raised there, that, you know, of course we can't ignore this kind of the influence and role of parents and carers, and you know, at home, and that intersection as well, so crucial. Great, thank you all to all the panel on that question. There's a couple of questions that are coming through the chat. So the one I want to pick up next is somebody said there was an earlier question about gender and maths anxiety. Do panel members have any thoughts about this, and why it might be that being no good at maths is more acceptable for girls than boys? Anyone on the panel keen to pick up on that one?
I think there still is I was going to say, in many cultures, it's still believed that boys, it's acceptable for girls not to be good at maths because it's important for boys and it's not important for girls. And not even in cultures. I mean, my own father thought it was a waste of time me learning maths because I'm a girl, you know, and I'm going to be a wife and I'm going to be a mother. Why do I need maths? And I think historically, even back in the 17th century, girls were actually taught that it would shrivel their wombs if they learnt maths. I mean, it was appalling. But I think there's a hangover still that girls are good at literacy and boys are good at maths. It's still there against all the efforts that STEM are making to encourage girls to take part. I think at home and generally in the public, it's still a perception that boys are naturally have that innate skill that we've been talking about, good at maths, and girls aren't. So it's acceptable for girls to say they're worried about it.
Thanks, Sue. Anyone else want to pick up on that one as well?
I can probably say a couple of things on that. It is an incredibly complex area, I think, when we look at gender and maths, and we can also kind of separate out attitudes towards maths in terms of gender. So is it a kind of a boys subject or a girls subject? That attitude that it's maybe more of a male domain is related to maths anxiety and general maths attitude. So clearly there needs to be a bit of work there, I think, to change those attitudes, because we know that those attitudes are related to things like anxiety as well. And you know, it's not just about formal education. You know, these attitudes are going to kind of permeate through all aspects of society, and particularly you know, the home environment and in the media. These kind of depictions of boys or girls, men, women involved in maths in various ways, I think, can really impact you know, children's self-beliefs about maths, and again, kind of inadvertently, in a very subtle way and very gradually, change their own self-beliefs and perceptions about maths. And I think one of the things we need to get a bit better at really is how maths is depicted in various ways, because there is still that very traditional sort of association of, you know, things like algebra, you know, being related to things that are boring, things that aren't relevant to real life. Whereas actually what we know is that maths, you know, permeates throughout all aspects of society, all sorts of jobs and all sorts of careers that might appeal to, you know, boys and girls alike. And I think that will certainly help in terms of overcoming some of those sort of gender beliefs about maths.
I think just to say on sort of the international scene, that it's almost universal that girls do as well as boys at maths. And it's almost universal that girls believe that they're much worse at maths than they are.
Yeah.
And it's very difficult, I think, to nail down exactly where, you know, clearly there's a lot of cultural input there, you know, from parents and siblings and so on. But it's very difficult, I think, to nail down exactly the reasons for the lack of confidence among girls.
Thank you, Margaret. Gillian, unless you are keen to answer this one, I'll move on to the next question. So just want to get at the risk here of just, I think there's a few more questions, so I want to let these run a bit, because I think we might get through a couple more, and it's really leading to some interesting debate. So would anyone this is from the chat, would anybody on the panel shed some light on whether there are any specific features about the subject, mathematics itself, that provokes anxiety among all ages and types of learners? Isn't the subject the principal cause? And if so, why? What aspects of the subject? So a big question there. Anyone brave enough to pick up on that one?
I don't mind coming in. I mean, maths is seen as, first of all, something that's either right or wrong, whereas there are sort of degrees of rightness in other subjects. So, you know, people get very anxious about being told they're wrong, whereas, you know, in other subjects, there's a more positive response that, you know, you're halfway there, but not quite. That's not obviously essential in maths, because you can have, it depends how it's taught and how if it's seen by teachers and students as something that's right or wrong, then that's a problem. It's also rather abstract, and you have a problem that people just see lots of symbols and feel they have no control or understanding of it. Whereas if you are seeing, you know, a piece of text, English text, say, you feel at least you can understand some of it. But there is this kind of notion that just doesn't mean anything at all to me. So I think that there's, you know, it becomes more, it can be seen as more alienating because of those particular features. And it also has some rather obscure vocabulary as well. You know, so I think that it can be presented, I think, as a subject which is something totally out there, nothing to do with you.
I think that's true what you said, Margaret, about right or wrong. Sorry, Sue. No, just about, you know, that was always the impression I had. You know, there was only one right answer, and now we do a lot of work in the school where we celebrate mistakes, and we deliberately choose children who have given the wrong answer. We work it out on the board and we celebrate, you know, oh, that's where you've gone wrong. Okay, so how can we fix it? And I think we've saw in our classrooms that children are no longer afraid to make mistakes because we celebrate them, and they're given praise because their mistake helped us to learn a different strategy. So we've, in our classroom, in our school, we've saw a sort of dip in maths anxiety amongst learners, because we're trying to shift away from that mindset that there's only one right or wrong way. Or there's only one right or wrong answer, and also that there's only one way to figure it out. There's actually lots of ways to come up with the answer, so that might be why, I guess.
I want to applaud that. I think it's also the relevance of maths, back to what I was talking about earlier, about the value of maths. Because when I talk to parents and I say, tell me about the maths you've done today, they say, oh no, I don't do maths. That's a classroom subject, and they see it as a discrete classroom subject. They don't see looking at a timetable, going shopping, filling their car with petrol, any of that as maths. And noting the question earlier on about algebra, again, I asked them what they didn't like about maths, and they said, oh, algebra, I can't do algebra. So I put up a really simple, you know, 4 plus square equals 5, and asked them to fill in the missing you know, Mrs. Square, and they could all do it. And I said, well done, you've all done algebra. And their self-esteem went through the roof. And I think it's just perceptions, and it's breaking down those perceptions, the relevance of why we do maths and where we use it, but also what the different parts of maths are actually useful for.
There is some research which suggests that people, if people can do it, it can't be maths. Maths is only things that they can't understand.
I would just add there as well that, you know, maths anxiety is very much related to a fear of failure, and, you know, like Margaret said, this sort of perception that, you know, things are basically right or wrong, and that means that there isn't much kind of scope for having a bit of an educated guess, or, you know, at least giving some kind of response. So, you know, if you take something that's kind of text-based or art-based, you know, a drawing, for example, most people feel as though even if they struggle with it, they can at least give some kind of response that might be acknowledged as being okay. Whereas maths, they feel as though if they get into a bit of a panic, a bit of a fluster, there's no kind of legitimate response or no kind of valid response that they can give. And there is a real fear of social evaluation there. And this is why we see maths anxiety, particularly in social situations. It might be in the class, or it might be, you know, sharing the cost of a meal in a restaurant, or it might be working out some change at the checkout in a shop. You know, those kind of situations that you feel as though you're being observed, you might feel as though you're being judged or evaluated, because it kind of impacts on that sense of fear of failure and fear of being negatively judged, and therefore maths kind of affects people differently to other subjects. But I would also completely agree with Sue's point there about how maths is more broadly perceived, because I completely see that maths is often synonymous with school, in a way that you don't have that with other subjects. So art, people don't think of art as just, well, that's something that happens at school and nowhere else. And sports, people don't automatically associate sports with school. Yet maths, it's very much kind of put into that box of that belongs at school kind of thing. And I think again that maybe it's something to do with the language that's used, or the way in which maths is taught in school. But changing those perceptions of what maths actually is, I think will certainly go some way towards alleviating anxiety and improving attitudes.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you, panel. That was a big question, and you really did grapple extensively with that one, and there's a huge amount in that. So thank you. I'm keen to come on to what is going to be our last area of discussion, the support that's needed. So the question is, when we talk about maths anxiety, how can we overcome these issues? How can teachers, teaching assistants, support workers, educators more broadly be supported to improve their confidence with maths and pass on the positive attitudes towards maths that you've talked about being so important and at risk with maths anxiety? So with this one, Margaret, I'd love to start with your reflections here, please.
Yeah. Okay. Well, first of all, I mean, to emphasize a point that's already been made, that maths anxiety is curable. It's not genetic, or it's something that you can actually overcome. The 4 ingredients of deep change in terms of maths attitudes among teachers are time, talk, expertise and motivation. And I think most of those have already been mentioned. I mean, Tom, I think, talked about, the ability to talk. Whether this is in initial training or in kind of formal CPD, professional development, or whether it's school-based or whether it's absolutely informal, then it seems as though you really enable people to change if you have time for them to discuss things with other people in a very open way and to talk about their own feelings and others. And also time to think about maths and the connections between it and how they can make it meaningful, and to really immerse themselves in these different ways of teaching and making sense of the things that they teach. Some degree of expertise seems to be needed, but sometimes that may be not the kind of external expert. In fact, the external expert can be the enemy. It's somebody who actually knows a little bit more about research, has more experience maybe, but we've come across teachers who've improved their attitudes extensively by just meeting together, talking about maths, and when they need a bit of input, going to somebody who knows a bit more, or reading a book between them. So it can be, different ways. I mean, we had one guy who used to meet in the pub with his brother-in-law who was a mathematician, and that was where the expertise came from. So there are different ways of doing it, and there are, as long as it has those kind of ingredients. And of course, motivation. Whether it starts at the beginning, people might be reluctant to go for initial training or a CPD course, but actually they're not going to get anything much out of it without a real motivation to change themselves. I mean, just to take that on, some of our initial training at the moment is hopelessly inadequate, I have to say. And I found as a governor of a primary school that we had teachers coming in, say we had an art teacher who'd been an art teacher in secondary, or a drama teacher who'd been pushed from secondary into primary, had never had any training at all about how to teach maths. We have people who are flung into initial training straight into classrooms and do most of their time there, sometimes in schools where there's nobody who knows very much about good maths teaching. So I think we do need to think, I might add that in China, a primary maths teacher has 5 years training. And our system is completely inadequate in relation to that. CPD, we have in the past had extensive CPD for primary maths teachers. The research seems to show that anything less than 15 days is not going to do anything very much. So 5 days here, 10 days there, at least 20, well, at least 15 anyway, probably 20, to even get started on a deep change of attitudes. And finally, the sort of national policy. We really do need a national policy which is going to, which believes that teachers can become expert at teaching, can become very positive about maths, can develop their own skills, and don't see teachers just as a way of, delivering sums and knowledge. Which is, I have to say, somewhat the kind of view at the moment. We have to see teachers as professionals, and we have to have a maths curriculum which emphasises the links between different areas of maths and between maths and its applications.
Thank you so much, Margaret. I mean, great to get that perspective of at both an individual level, a system level, and then national policy level as well in terms of what's needed. Thank you. Let's come on to Tom next, please.
Yeah, again, I can completely agree with Margaret there. So, I mean, just to reiterate a couple of points, that the time and space issue is really important. So, having those kind of dedicated CPD sessions, whether that's kind of informal or formal, just having that time and space to openly discuss some of these concerns, anxiety, lack of confidence when it comes to maths, which I think probably relates to a general kind of culture shift within schools, within teacher training programs, and also at a kind of national level as well. Just to acknowledge some of these issues and to create a bit of a dialogue, really, because I think part of the problem with avoidance is these things often aren't spoken about. People sort of shy away from conversations about maths, and therefore any kind of psychological barriers associated with maths. So I think initially just having that sort of inlet towards open dialogue, and teachers feeling comfortable and feeling secure to actually speak about these things. So I think a bit of a culture shift in schools would be helpful. And then in terms of actually supporting teachers, once they've got past that initial barrier and they're able to speak about things, what can we do? Well, lots of strategies that work for children might, and older students might well work for teachers as well. As I said before, teachers are human, and many of these strategies are going to apply, just as well to them. But if we talk about some of the very kind of teacher-specific anxieties when it comes to maths, that might be around specific elements of maths. It might be handling maths in the classroom, dealing with those tricky questions and things like that. So I think schools, teacher training programs need to look at exactly what it is about maths in the classroom that makes teachers and trainee teachers anxious, and that might be simple things such as improved peer support, that having those support mechanisms in place to really avoid people dropping out, so we retain good quality teachers, and just support them moving through their career, whether that's in the very early stages or whether they encounter some anxiety later on.
Thank you, Tom. Can we come on to Gillian next, please?
Yeah, I think school leaders have got a part to play. I think, teachers need to be able to feel comfortable in speaking to the management team and saying that they are perhaps suffering a little bit from maths anxiety, and rather than be judged, we would never judge a child who was struggling. So rather than be judged, I think school leaders, we should be supporting them and saying, right, well, have you tried doing this course, or what about reading a little bit about this? So I think, you know, providing a safe space within schools and that culture of being able to talk about it openly so that they don't feel the pressure. And also, you know, creating more opportunities like this where teachers and educators can come together and engage in this sort of dialogue. And I think we spoke about this earlier in the week. This is the sort of first event that I can think of where educators are encouraged to talk about maths anxiety. You know, I've been involved in things about maths anxiety with learners or with their parents, but actually focusing on teachers is really important. So hopefully, you know, moving forward, we can tap into contacting the universities or reaching out to schools and provide more opportunities and putting on more events like this in the future.
Thank you, Gillian. And Sue, what are your thoughts here?
Yeah, it's a case of last but not least here, isn't it? I mean, I agree with all the points that have gone before, and I'm going to be very careful not to repeat them. But I do want to come firstly from the angle of initial teacher training, because that's something I've been involved in the last 10 years. And I've done it concurrently with working with National Numeracy. So I've been very fortunate to be able to complement the messages across. But I do know from going into other universities and teacher training establishments that it's, you know, it's not always the case. They haven't got that background and understanding. The majority of ITT courses that I've seen are really aimed at developing pedagogy and methodology. They don't address anything like maths anxiety or how the teacher's feeling. The other point I want to make is that given the entry requirements to teaching, there's often an assumption about the level of expertise that trainees have. But that could be, in my case, it was an O-level that was taken in 1972. You know, I got a grade A because I could apply methods and formulas. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no idea why it worked. It wasn't until I came into teaching that, oh, that's why that works. That's why that clicks together. I didn't suffer from maths anxiety. I thought I could do it. I almost suffered from arrogance. And it wasn't until I taught maths that I realized I actually didn't have a clue. I didn't know. So whichever way you look at it, I think looking at the qualifications that trainees are bringing to bear is not a very good measure. They're often old, they're often gained without understanding, or their experience in maths anxiety. And that's not something they put on an application form, as I said before. I think they should be able to declare it somehow so that appropriate support can be given. I think the training should therefore include addressing their own anxieties, but also how to recognise it in pupils, because I don't think that's covered very adequately either. It should start at a very low entry point, and it should build confidence and enthusiasm for the subject, making it enjoyable for the trainees, and then that will be transferred to pupils. So they should be supported with very simple planning so that anxious teachers can focus on clear learning objectives. Sometimes when they take a script, it's got several learning objectives in, and they get bogged down in it really. And they should be encouraged to walk through that plan prior to teaching it, so that they feel very confident with how they're going to address any misconceptions before they arrive. I think Tom made the point, and I'll just reiterate that strategies to support anxious pupils are also going to support anxious teachers. And it will shift the focus from themselves as well if they're trying to meet that anxiety in pupils. I've got a whole list here, which would just be quite boring to go through, but I've got them if anybody wants some, of strategies to support in the classroom. But I think I'd like to finish with, it's a well-known quote, that if we're able to make children believe they can solve a calculation in front of them, rather than having to start from a position where they believe they're bound to fail, that is surely half the battle. And I think that's the same with teachers. And the point that Gillian made about support coming from whether it's ITT or for recently qualified teachers or SLT, it should be there throughout a career for all teachers.
Thank you so much, Sue. A really nice and important way to finish the discussion on that point. Maybe an opportunity to come back here actually, because one of the questions that we've had, and some encouragement I think also in the chat as well around the strategies, is the question around what strategies would you encourage a head teacher to put in place in their school to address maths anxiety amongst staff and to promote positive attitudes towards maths. And of course, I've got into this a bit, but let's think, a bit more, specifically what a head teacher might do. Maybe there's a couple of more thoughts there from you, Sue, on those strategies.
Well, I think the first thing is, and I'm not putting it there as a barrier, but a head teacher can only do so much if the teacher is willing to admit they suffer from maths anxiety. Yeah. You can't, enforce something onto somebody. But I think the role of a head teacher is to model. And if they can model that enthusiasm, they can model that passion, and they can have the open discussions within the staff meetings and sharing things, then hopefully they can engender that atmosphere where people feel they're able to discuss anxieties, and it can be addressed as a group, as a team would be my ideal approach.
Thank you, Sue. Any other thoughts from other panelists on that question around school strategies?
I would say, oh, sorry, Margaret, you go.
No, you carry on, Tom.
I would say to actually ask what is it that's contributing to that anxiety, because as I say, there is sometimes an assumption that maths anxiety is simply anxiety of numbers, and that could be part of it, but actually maths anxiety is so much more than that. So I think actually speaking to teachers to encourage them to feel secure in actually opening up and talking about what is it that's creating that anxiety. And in some cases it might be a lack of confidence in specific areas of maths, and things can be put in place obviously through peer support or through CPD sessions to try and improve skills and knowledge in those specific areas. Or it might be something completely unrelated to that. And it might be anxiety around, like I say, the actual teaching of maths, which might be something to do with pedagogical approaches. So I think actually just, asking the question and encouraging people in a non-judgmental way to talk about what's creating the anxiety will then help in terms of identifying what needs to be done to reduce it.
I was just going to add something about teaching assistants that, I found at the school where I was a governor, the teaching assistants came and said, could we please have a sort of separate class for teaching assistants, because we don't really want to, expose our ignorance in front of the teachers. I'm drawing it from a colleague, Mike Askew, who runs lots of very successful courses for teachers, particularly in South Africa now, where he calls it I Hate Maths classes. And the teachers come along with the expectation that, it's okay to say I hate maths. And just slowly goes through bits of maths so that everybody can talk about what they can understand or not understand about, simple additions or long multiplication or adding fractions or whatever it is. And I think that seems to be successful. I mean, I'm sure with teachers, but certainly having teaching assistants as a separate group is a really good idea too.
Absolutely. And I think if you teach teaching assistants as you would teach children without being patronizing, but breaking it down to that level, they're really grateful.
Wonderful. Thank you, Margaret. And it does seem to me from the chat that the opportunity to go much more into strategies would be very welcome. I'm keen, Gillian, just maybe a word from you on this one before we close.
Sorry, can you repeat the question again, Sam?
Yeah, so we're thinking about strategies, school strategies. Anything that you, from your experience, just a moment or two we've got. I'm just keen to hear anything that you found.
Yeah, just kind of school strategies, I guess. Sorry, I was just looking through the questions at the side, and I can see lots of comments about concrete, using concrete resources and things like that. So I was getting a bit mixed up there. Yeah, I kind of like that idea of the I hate maths class type thing. It's interesting to hear you talking about teaching assistants, because in Scotland we don't quite have, we've got assistants, but they don't have to be qualified, and and they often sort of have the same anxieties that we do, and they talk about we're not kind of sure how to support. So having those opportunities to train our support staff, promoting the culture that we can, and also just within our maths curriculum, just having a wide range of strategies available, not just textbook based, but lots of different resources, and providing opportunities for teachers to develop themselves further through lots of courses.
Thanks so much, Gillian. And it does strike me that we could carry on this topic. There's clearly a demand for it. So you never know. Maybe a subject for a future event. But you know, it has been an absolutely incredible discussion and such a wide range of views and fascinating insight. We do have to bring it to a close, and I'm conscious of everybody's time and wanting to finish at 6 o'clock as well. So we do need to bring it to a close just now. And I think what's great is we've got through, I think, most of the questions. We've done our best. The panel have done their best, and I think done an incredible job of getting through a broad range of questions as well as the content of the discussion. So before we close, I did just want to say a huge thank you to everybody who's joined this event, who's joined to listen in. I hope, as I certainly have, you've learned something from the discussion, and you've had the opportunity to reflect on what these points, these strategies, this looking at the implications and impact, what this means for you in whatever context or role that you are working. I'm not going to attempt to summarize the discussion because it's been so rich and so much in there. Ultimately, incredibly, I think, hopeful in that, this is changeable, it is addressable. Maths anxiety is something that can be overcome, and in doing so, we have a tremendous opportunity to equip each other, educators, with both life skills and that broader implications that it has on addressing anxiety, building self-esteem, and so on. So ultimately a hopeful position to end on. I'd also like to say a huge thank you to my colleagues Anna and Mila at National Numeracy, and to the Maths Anxiety Trust team, particularly to Shirley Conran and to the Chief Executive Caroline Schott, for being so instrumental in making this event happen today. I think, importantly, a massive thank you to our panel. Professor Margaret Brown, thank you. Tom Hunt, thank you. Gillian Lynch, thanks so much. And to Sue Skyrme as well. Thank you all so much for giving up so kindly your time this afternoon, and for providing such thoughtful insight. It is hugely, hugely appreciated and will have made a real difference. Please remember, everybody, that there is a recording of this event. It's going to be available on the Maths Anxiety Trust website, National Numeracy website, and on the Learners website as well. And with that, I will wish everybody a lovely evening. I hope you've enjoyed the event, and you never know, hope to see you soon. We'll take on to the next level. Thank you, everybody.